This is the City General Hospital. I'm a physiotherapist who has worked here for nearly 40 years. During this time I've met so many people and made so many friends. There is a lot of history here, a lot of events which take place, and these we should like you to share.
We're present standing outside the Cheetham's part of the new surgical hospital. This plaque commemorates the hospital of St. Loy, which is thought to have been situated on this site in the early 1600s. Following the disappearance of the hospital of St. Loy, which is thought to have been a leper colony, the land went into disuse for some years and was known as the Spital's land. When the workhouse was built in the 1830s, the authorities decided that they needed a farm in which to produce the food that was needed by the workhouse inmates and staff. So for many years this land was farmland and continued to be in use as a farm in the early 1950s.
In 1832, the workhouse started here. 2 buildings were erected to replace the workhouse at Penkhull. In 1842, this is one of 3 buildings erected to come into line with the Poor Law Commissioner's ideas that people should be categorised into sex, age and physical condition. The children were put into here, and the teaching rooms were on the lower floor and the dormitories were on the upper floor. The schoolmaster and schoolmistress resided in the room at the top, with the infants lodging just behind them as well. It was thought very unsavoury that the children and the adults were to mix in the workhouse. The idea of a deterrent workhouse was really coming to the fore, and they thought that by separating the children they wouldn't pick up their parents' depraved habits and would make themselves useful members of society.
This here was a school play yard, and beyond that building there was the other, so that the boys and girls were kept separate from each other. Both in the classroom, they never really came together very much at all. And there were a flight of steps from here, from this yard here, up to the boardroom, and the actual entrance to the boardroom was about where the tree is there. This was a magnificent building, and it was here until the early 60s when it was demolished. It was an open panel building with a large boardroom table and really beautiful accommodation.
A lot of people seeking admission to the workhouse were in a very poor state of health. This not only impaired the fact that they couldn't earn their keep, but also spread a lot of disease amongst the other inmates. This was the last of the 1842 additions. It was the porter's lodge and the vagrants' wards. And this window here, as you can see, is ideally situated, as this is which housed the porters, and they could survey the whole of the workhouse site from this point. The segregation of the sexes went on also at the chapel, with separate entrances for the males and females. As you can see, the one on the left has now been bricked up and a window added.
This building was erected in 1866 to replace the original 1842 school building. Much larger than the old building, it housed many more children, and of course it required much better cooking facilities. So this rather magnificent range grate was put in at the time and used for all the needs of the children for cooking. And when the school building was closed towards the end of the century, the range was partitioned off by building up a partition here, and so it was lost to view until about 5 years ago, when workmen came along to demolish this wall and discovered, to their surprise, behind the partition, this grate, along with many utensils used in cooking in the original kitchen, and of course of the original ovens, more or less as they had been when in use. This staircase was used by children. They were paraded up and down for bathing and also for dining, and they had to be observed by the very few staff. And so when the building was put up, they left spaces in the walls so that the children could be watched to make sure that they behaved themselves when they were going up and down the stairs. When children arrived in the school for accommodation, they were first of all brought down into this building, this basement, where they were stripped of their clothing, scrubbed, their clothing was disinfected, and then they were taken from here through the archway, which is bricked up to the left there, and they were taken into an immersion bath, which is very similar to a small swimming bath. And then they were fitted out with clean workhouse clothing and taken away for their accommodation, more or less to stay here until they were old enough to go out into the community.
This building was part of the schoolhouse known as the New School, which was opened in 1866. And this particular extension of the building was used as a laundry and as a bakehouse for the children who were housed in the main block, the block which was partly dormitories and partly school. This continued to be used until the turn of the century, when the children were sent out to the Penkle homes to live and to the local schools for their education. Then the building was closed down for some time and later came into use as a nurse training school, and continued to be used as a nurse training school right through and into the 1970s. In more recent times, the building has been taken over by the Department of Psychology.
This is the 1875 hospital, which was built to replace the 1842 hospital, which of course had become inadequate for the number of the workhouse inmates who needed hospital treatment. It was adequate for just a few more years when they had to extend the buildings into what became eventually known as the Surgical Square. But of course it was a general hospital in those days for patients with all kinds of medical problems. It has undergone many changes since those days, but it was a very complicated building and was built on different levels, so it made it extremely difficult for the staff to move patients about. The corridor here is a fairly recent construction, certainly in the last about 30 years ago. Beyond this is the lower part of the building, and in the basement of this building there is a ward known as a lock ward, where in the early usage of this building they housed women who had what are now known as socially undesirable diseases, some of whom had been sent by the courts for incarceration in here until presumably they were certified as being fit to return to the community.
Not long after the 1875 hospital was built, it was realized that even more hospital accommodation was required for the workhouse, and so two more blocks were built, and these were opened in 1884. They were to be for the treatment of male and female patients, and children as well, and eventually became known as the Surgical Square. This continued as a surgical square until the new surgical hospital was opened in 1989.
It wasn't until the late 19th century that psychiatric illnesses were clearly defined. So that meant that most cases were kept here at the City General grounds. In 1892, though, the serious cases had been going to the county asylum at Cheddleton, and they had sent word to here that they were very overcrowded. That meant that we needed psychiatric wards building down here on this site. So between 1893 and 1894, the 2 blocks were built. One housed the males and one housed the females.
I'm standing outside one of the cells in the vagrant block. This block was built in 1895 to accommodate the many vagrants, in fact more than 2,000 a year in those days, who passed this site on their way either to or from Manchester and alongside the road here. And the other reason for building the vagrant block on this site was that it's just across the way from the canal, which brought along the large stones to be broken up by the vagrants and later to be returned as small chippings. The vagrants were usually ex-servicemen, either trying to find their way home, and during the Irish potato famine, many Irishmen came over here. This caused a lot of distress among the local population because they felt that they were criminals and undesirable, so this was not a popular building at the time. However, what happened here was that the vagrant was brought into the building, or arrived at the building, and was given something to eat and drink and had a bath, and was then put into one of these cells for overnight stay. And you see from the cell that it consists of the original door with a kind of latching device on the outside and a small peephole, spy hole, through which the supervisors could see the vagrant inside. And then having put them inside, the vagrant was locked inside for the night. And the following morning, he was awakened fairly early, and then he had a little breakfast, which consisted of a kind of gruel and tea, and then walked through into a smaller cell on the outer part of this building, which was called a working cell, and in which he was expected to break up as much as 300 weights of stone into smaller chippings for road surfacing. And then these he passed through a grill in the outer wall, and these chippings were then carried in wheelbarrows across the way to the canal barge waiting at the canal side. This board was eventually installed into the building to indicate the alarm bell which sounded in the various cells. The reason for this was that some of the vagrants, when they were arrived here, were ill, and so it was felt necessary that they should call if they were in distress. And so the porter, the attendant or porter who was on call at that time, would come along to the appropriate cell, see what had happened. We're standing in the main entrance of the City General Hospital grounds alongside the very busy A34, which was originally the London Road, the main route between Manchester and the south. And just across the way from the present hospital is the graveyard where so many of the inmates of the workhouse days were buried, often 2 and 3 to a grave, and the graves were unmarked. Just beyond the graveyard there is a canal along which the large stones were brought for breaking by the inmates, and the smaller gravel taken away later. Just behind me is a building which was the original mortuary, in which the bodies of the dead inmates were kept until the time came for burial, and this was still in use in the 1950s.
In 1907, the fire station was necessary to be built as part of the old lead works, which was used previously, had to be demolished for the new improvements. The fire station was manned by officers from the workhouse, and these were given instruction once a quarter by Stoke Fire Brigade. The reason for its closure is probably due to the fact of Newcastle's own fire brigade's improved efficiency, plus the fact that a lot of the male officers who used to reside in the workhouse no longer did so it was very hard to find men to man the pumps. The bakehouse behind me is also part of the 1907 improvements. The top floor was where the grain was initially stored, the middle floor was used for the mixing, and then by lowering the dough down a series of chutes to the ground floor is where it was eventually cooked. A red hot brick was fetched from the kitchen and immersed into cold water, and this was used to get the bread to prove by causing steam.
During the 1920s and 30s, the hospital was growing in size and was becoming a large general hospital. And because there was a very great need in those days for the treatment of patients with tubercular conditions such as pulmonary tuberculosis, it was decided to build a sanatorium. This was the sanatorium, and it continued to be used as a sanatorium until just a few years ago, when it became a department for the treatment of people with chest disorders. In the early days, patients were treated by collapse therapy, and until the advent of anti-tubercular drugs, the treatment was fairly drastic, and patients were in this hospital for many, many months and were treated by open-air treatment. The whole of the front of this building was absent in those days. It was only in more recent times that the glass panels have been put in. Patients were treated by being nursed in cubicles with open doors and open windows, so they almost froze to death.
The physiotherapy department at the City General Hospital began in a small room in the doctor's residence. The main patients being treated at that time were those from the workhouse and from the older generation who were resident at the time. The work expanded during the Second World War when soldiers were admitted for rehabilitation. Some were Americans, some came from the Free French forces, others were of the Polish forces, mainly stationed from the Leek area. In 1948, the present physiotherapy building was allocated, in which services expanded to all the acute areas of the City General Hospital, which now include the North Staff's Maternity Hospital. As it is a listed building, the interior aspect retains the same rooms as were there originally, but in the mid-1980s, an open exercise area and a new gymnasium were added on.
This is the redesigned modern occupational therapy department as it is today, with an establishment of 11 staff. When I started at the City General in January 1951, I was engaged as single-handed occupational therapist for the whole hospital, medical, surgical and psychiatric wards. I was told there had been an occupational therapist here during the war, especially to treat servicemen who were on the wards of the then new block. When the soldiers left, the occupational therapist moved also, but she had a helper who stayed on and was here until 1948-49. When I arrived, the department had been closed for over 18 months. And I was in a department where the physiotherapy department is now, sharing it with the physiotherapists, and the path lab was upstairs in the same building.
When I started my training in 1961-63, I went to the premature baby unit, which was at the Lions in those days, and I just saw babies in incubators. And really, the premature baby unit, stroke and neonatal unit has advanced so much now because there's so much equipment, and babies are surviving from an earlier age, and they do very well. We are now trying to increase the funds for our antenatal units, because unless we have good antenatal care, then we will probably have more small babies that are going to need this intensive care. So it's really a matter of shifting the emphasis.
After this guided tour of some of the buildings and history of the City General, Let's hear from some more people who've worked here over the years.
My memory goes back a lot further than anyone said, because I was here in the late 30s. And apart from liking to pay a tribute to Doc Poplars, as we called him, who was father to us all, really looked after the staff and so on. The extraordinary thing is, although there was nearly 1,000 beds, Mr. Dory would probably verify this, there was only 5 or 6 doctors. I won't go on about the specialities. There was certainly the only speciality was the maternity. There was an obstetrician and gynecologist there. Apart from that, the other doctors, they got to be prepared to take your appendix out, put a plaster, set a fracture, take your tonsils out, and so on. And as I say, there was 900 to 1,000 beds here then. So although I see lots of beautiful buildings around, there still aren't all that many more beds. And yet there's all these wonderful specialities.
I came to the hospital just as war broke out, and I think my first impressions in the dining room were, it was so quiet. We weren't really allowed to talk during meals, and it was just like going into church. The Home Sister used to sit at what called a table there. And among other things, we used to have our rations in jam jars. We used to have a jam jar with a ration of sugar and butter and margarine. And these had to be in on Monday morning. And I remember the Home Sister, we used to have Grace in those days. She was a sweet lady, and she used to say, now your jam jars must be in on Monday morning, and she'd say, Grace, for what we have received, make us truly thankful. But if you don't bring your jars in on time, you won't get your rations.
I'd like to say something about the changing face, actually, of the city. I trained in London, where all the wards and departments were under one roof. And when I came to the City General in '48, it was a real eye-opener. All the beautiful green there was about the place. The drive was absolutely beautiful, with overhanging trees and geraniums. And in the summer, to walk up that drive was out of this world. They had the lodge at the bottom with the 2 porters and the switchboard. And you always had a friendly word coming in and going out. And orchards, and the farmland there. And the back of the Nines block, there was a field. And to see that waving corn now where the geriatric hospital is, I think we're giving a better service. You're treating more people. There's quite a bit of nostalgia for the old buildings.
We have to remember, of course, that we came into nursing 40 years ago, just as the changeover from to the National Health Service had taken place. And there were very great changes in every other aspect of hospital life taking place. I mean, we all nursed patients who were from the old workhouse. The thing I remember most about my first 3 years, that is my training years, was happiness. I was very fortunate in that I worked with some very nice people, and apart from those that I worked with from the nursing staff, of course, there were also so many others. And I remember in particular the domestic staff, because some of them were real characters in those days. The lady who worked in the kitchen ruled the roost in the kitchen, and woe betide you if you went into the kitchen and did anything that she didn't approve of. And she also was a kind of head cook and bottle washer. And I remember on one occasion, one lady, she was very, very kind really, who used to make little snacks for you unofficially. And on one occasion, it was Good Friday, and I was on duty. I've been on duty for quite a long time, and she came to me feeling very sorry for me, and she said, come here, Doc. She always called everybody Doc, and she said, come here, Doc. Would you like a bun? I've got one in the oven, she said. And prior to this same lady who was in trouble, a sister had heard her calling me Doc, you see, and so she came to me afterwards and she said, oh, Doc, I'm in trouble, Doc. She said, sister's heard me calling you Doc, Doc, and I haven't got to call you Doc again, Doc.
There have been tremendous changes, and Albert mentioned that you knew the domestics, you knew the engineers, you knew the porters. It was a smaller place, but far more informal and friendly than it is now. I had one particular domestic, Phoebe, when I was in the cardiac department, And Phoebe had a fund of stories that happened to her as a domestic. 3 of the domestics had had a bit of a party in Mrs. Ellis's little kitchen, and they'd got a gramophone playing The Shores of Minnetonka. They were wheeling this out, and Matron came down, and the other 2 shot, leaving Phoebe still wheeling the gramophone with The Shores of Minnetonka playing.
I was here when Matron Brown started at the hospital, and then we had an influx of Irish nurses, which were very good, and problems with them, that come with them, all new recruits. But I remember Matron Brown because it was just in 1956, I think it was, that I left to have one of the children, and she was very kind. She never ever forgot a name of a staff, and I used to have a letter about once a month to invite me back on the hospital staff, even for one night a week. I think she was very kind. She was very strict with the nurses, and she would actually do the high ledge dusting with white gloves.
We've talked a bit about the characters of the staff in the hospital, but there's also characters of patients. And in the laboratory in the early days, we didn't used to have cleaners cleaning the floors. We used to have the patients from the psychiatric block, a lot of these people who were left from the old workhouse days. And the consultant in charge then insisted that everybody was correctly dressed. And these patients used to come up from the psychiatric block, and they weren't allowed to come if they hadn't got false teeth in. And to what I gathered, there was one set of false teeth that used to go on the rounds, and it was the person whose turn it was for the false teeth who used to come into the lab and polish the floors. And there was one particular chap, actually, these teeth never fitted him very well, and he was a big chap, he looked just like Frankenstein. And he always had this grin on his face because the teeth didn't fit. And so all you saw was just this mouthful of teeth. And people actually resisted talking to him because when you spoke to him, this handful of teeth had to come out before he could answer, you see. So he walked around with this big grin on his face all day. And then there was another chap, and his name was Charlie. You probably all remember Charlie. And he used to come in with the teeth as well. And when they polished the floor, they had a big drum of yellow polish with a big dirty old stick in it. And he had Parkinson's, this chap did as well, which is a bit unfortunate, because he used to bring this stick out and his hand used to be going like this, and the polish never got on the floor, but it used to go down the staff. So when Charlie came in to do the floors, the staff disappeared.
I remember this hospital one night being staffed by 14 people. Imagine that today, 14 nurses. And Sister Jones, who was the night superintendent, she did the theatre, and she was in the theatre the whole of the night.
I remember working with one girl on nights on Ward 80, and we were on there, and these moths invaded the wards. Well, we left the patients because we were both terrified of moths. And it wasn't Len who found us, it was one of the night sisters standing on 2 chairs in the office, screaming. Blue murder, all the patients were awake, and all these moths had come in the office, and there was no way we could get rid of them. And despite numerous requisitions, please get rid of the moths. And we just put up with it. That was part of our training, how to deal with moths. But when Len was talking about night duty, from a student's point of view, I thought it was good. We had responsibility. Although in some aspects we were taught by fear. You were terrified if you were left in charge of a ward. You'd pace up and down. You wouldn't dare to sit down. You'd be checking everybody. Were they dead? Were they sleeping? Because you didn't really know as a student. And you relied very much on your sense of really your responsibility, but your fear as well that something would go wrong. And you were desperately waiting for the night sister or the charge nurse to come. You'll be here at 3 o'clock. I'll be all right till then.
Some of my most enjoyable experience was on the Cheethams block on night duty. And I remember 1 or 2 occasions, obviously some were sad, but some were a joy really. And there's one in particular that I remember, a little boy named Ernie, who will now be about 40 years of age, I should think, not more. And this little boy, one night he couldn't get off to sleep, and we had a fire in the middle of the ward, a stove, which was coal or coke fired, and it was very warm in the main ward, and really very cosy at night. And this little boy was in the side ward, and I went to him and I said, "What's the problem, Ernie?" He said, "I can't go to sleep, Mr. Wilson." So I said, "Well, I'll tell you what we'll do." I said, "I'll take you into the ward and we'll sit in front of the fire and I'll get you off to sleep on my knee." He said, "All right." So I sat down in the armchair in front of the tire, and it was very relaxing, and fortunately the rest of the ward was quiet, and after a few minutes I felt him tugging here, and he said, "Excuse me, Mr. Wilson, but which of us is supposed to be going to sleep?"
I was on the babies ward for many years, and when I first went on to, there weren't any cubicles in that ward. The cots were just down, open on either side. I think it was a Nightingale's type of ward. And my desk was in the centre. I didn't even have an office. And there was a little ward off the corridor where we had just 4 premature babies. We didn't have a proper PEM unit in those days. And we didn't have incubators really at that time. We had little boxes, little white boxes, and the little babies on with the heat just underneath controlled. Later on, of course, we had incubators, and technology rapidly grew as the years went by. But when I think of just the 2 taps, one at the top of the ward and one at the bottom, we didn't wear gowns and masks in those days really like we did at a later stage. And of course, as years went by, we had the ward cubicles, and a lot of money was spent upgrading it. And I really spent a very happy time. And I was pleased that earnest visiting came in, because at that early stage we only had visiting perhaps once a day. In training days we only had it once a month, and that was pretty awful. Then we had unrestricted visiting, which was helpful both to the babies, the staff and the mothers. We used to let them help in the duties. But I was very sad when Cheetham was closed, really. But I was delighted that in my time they did have a new hospital, because years ago, when we had the consultants coming sometimes, we had well over the number of babies that we should have nursed. We had babies' cots pushed in anyway. And sometimes in the winter months, when bronchitis and pneumonia was relevant in those days, we had nearly twice the number of babies we should have had. And problems arose, of course, in those conditions, but it was surprising how we got by. We had oxygen tents and steam tents and you name it, and we had it. Thankfully, steam tents went out. They do use them, I think, a little, but nothing like the old days when we used to have to put them up ourselves with it was rather an arrangement like the things you put washing on, made of wood, you know, the drying thing, and sheets around, and steam tents, steam kettle rather, on a tray near the bed. It strikes you with horror when you think of it, doesn't it?
I always think that the biggest innovation for us all was the blood transfusion sets. When we can think back, those of us that used to have to send to the laboratory for a blood transfusion giving set, and a tin box, as it were, sealed with a piece of sellotape, as we remember it, and rubber tubing. And when you think of it today, and I often think, you know, with all the cross-infection, etc., how very fortunate we were that there was no more cross-infection carried through these transfusion sets, because, you know, when you think about it, rubber tubing and what it is today, it is a really marvellous innovation.
Yeah. Our first experience with computers was a box called the TARDIS. It was a teleprinter, and we had to go out and get the patient's details off it. And you sort of put the key in the lock, open the door, and when you stepped inside on a mat, the light came on, but the door had to close behind you to facilitate this. And you typed in what you wanted and pressed the relevant buttons, and the machine started. And with luck, you would get the information off. Without luck, the paper kept on coming off until you were mountains deep in paper, and only then could you get out once it had stopped.
When I first started nursing, there were no such things as the CSD. We had to make all our own dressings. All gauze had to be cut by hand, and all this was done, incidentally, in the visiting hours, and that was from 2 till 4. And all the dressings had to be cut in 2 hours, and all the drums packed. Now they have the CSD and everything comes to the ward. Fantastic for the nurses.
Well, with the advent of the Central Sterile Supplies Department, that was a department that actually took some of the nursing skills away from us. What it actually did was, for instance, if we wanted to do a dressing, normally as nurses we'd have to prepare the dressing, cut the lint or cut some cotton wool, pack it in a drum and actually sterilise it ourselves. That department took that job off us. It became a separate part. It wasn't part of nursing anymore. And the same has happened with instrumentation in the new hospital, whereas nurses used to actually use an autoclave and they'd use disinfectants to actually clean instruments, and they'd actually lay the instruments out and they'd have to gown up to do all that. Whereas all that has gone now. All that happens in a theatre is we just write an order out and say what we want in the way of instruments, or the wards do the same, say what they want in the way of dressings, and they actually come up to the ward and you open this wonderful pack and everything is there. But the character went out of it because learning instruments was an art. We used to have rhymes to learn them. And we'd go through the actual rhyme saying, I will know these instruments, because you were frightened that if you didn't know them, if somebody asked you to pass something, you wouldn't know the name. And I think that's where we are becoming de-skilled with the actual packs.
When we were in training, we had to set our own trolleys. And now what you do, you go into the cupboard and get out a pack. It's the same in our theatres. We used to have a sterilising room, and part of your training was spent in the sterilising room, setting trolleys and sterilising the instruments for surgery. Nowadays, it all comes through CSSD and in packs, and all the packs are taken along to our new hospital, to the modern theatres there, and the pack goes in on the trolley and is undone in the theatre. And that there is no setting of trolleys, so the tradition and knowing exactly what you're using will actually go now, I think. So there are skills which we will not be able to pass on because it's made too easy.
Well, I think we have got photographs, and also that we've got a nursing history group and museum group that we're trying to keep all the old things of the city. At the moment we're short of space, and but if anybody's interested, that we do have a group going to preserve all the old things of the city, and also the instruments that we used in the old days.
I work on the medical block, which used to be called the Old Nines block, and in recent years that's undergone tremendous change. From having a female coronary care unit, which has only been open the past 4 or 5 years. It only used to be male coronary care, but now women are catching up in having heart attacks. It has shown that we do need a unit for them as well. And more recent times where we'll be having a medical assessment unit. This started only last year, where it was called a mini casualty, where we had people with chest pain came in on a 999 ambulance, came straight to the medical assessment unit and then straight onto the ward, which patients were being treated quickly and recovering better than waiting for hours in casualty, finally getting down to us onto the medical wards. This has been a tremendous change, and it's become a very busy and acute unit over recent years.
I think for the patient, one of the most daunting experiences they have is when they actually go to theatre. And certainly on the old surgical square, it was a mammoth feat. I worked on Ward 79, an old ward that was split level, and we'd got a lift between 2 floors. So you'd get your patient ready, and they'd got to go into this lift, which some people don't like lifts, as we know. But as well as actually getting them ready in the normal fashion for theatre, in the winter we had to wrap them in a space blanket, because the next encounter they met at the bottom of the lift was a long corridor that let in all the rain, the sleet, there was a few drafts, there was boxes or trolleys in the corridor, and nurse would toddle along with the 2 porters. Well, she'd run if she could because it was that cold. And then she'd turn into the theatres, and it was a matter of gauging the angles. If you were lucky, you didn't give them a bump, and if you were unlucky, they had quite a number of bumps on the way down. So the way the pre-med worked, we'll never really know. Most people didn't complain too much. But in the actual old theatres themselves, there was just the 3 theatres, and I think that is where we've actually gained in the new surgical development, because we've now got a suite of actually 8 theatres, with obviously the modern technology that goes with them. whereas on the old square we'd got just the small 3 theatres with a very small recovery bay. But I'm sure if we compared the figures as to actually the amount of work that was done in them theatres to the work that's being done in the new ones, at the moment I think they would be on par, because we're still teaming up in the new development. But the patients really had an experience. When they came into the surgical square, there was no two ways about it. They understood what the weather was like from day one, always. And I think they went out feeling they had actually not only been through an operation, but they'd also achieved something, having been through all the little nooks and crannies of the surgical square. And I think that's something that patients will always remember, that it was a character building. It was full of warmth with the people who worked there.
We've just now recently gone through a massive change, a closure of a hospital with a lifetime of history. We've closed down the surgical square, which has been a home and help and a recovery area for many, many people in this area, Stoke-on-Trent and Newcastle and the surrounding districts. We've closed down our wards and we have reopened the new surgical development. This was opened in October of last year, and the closure was very heartbreaking. The opening was a joy with trepidation, actually. We tried to take with us the feelings and the care and the training that we had in our old wards to reopen the new hospital. And hopefully the staff who've moved over there have taken the same atmosphere with us, or at least we're trying to. Over the last few years we have seen lots of changes in student training. On the wards there's been the introduction of foster nurses for students and pupils. We've seen the phasing out of pupil nurse training. The last of the pupils are now coming through. The last of the 3-year training period students are on the way through now. And then we shall begin, once again that it's changed, and we shall begin on Project 2000 students, which, as Ms Wilson has said, is an academic training.
Well, as you've already heard, the City General Hospital has a very long tradition of caring for people and caring for the sick. And actually, from where I'm standing, I can see buildings that are well over 100 years old. But I think we're actually entering, or indeed just entered, a whole new era in the City General's history. Behind me, we've got the very splendid new surgical and paediatric development, which represents a very major investment into the City General Hospital. As you know, this centralises cold surgery in one place. We've got over 350 beds, 8 operating theatres, and a complete children's unit all in one place. And it's a tremendous investment. Looking to the future, though, we've got further plans for the orthopaedic hospital, which is due to move down in a few years' time, further developments in psychiatry, in medicine, and in care of the elderly. So I think as we look towards the 21st century, we see the City General taking a lead in acute services in North Staffordshire. I believe we've got the staff, we've got the motivation, and we've got the space on this site to take a very leading role, and I believe this is a very exciting time in our history.
So let's see some other facets of life in today's City General.
I came here in March 1961 as an electrician. In those days there was 2 electricians on site and 1 foreman, 2 fitters, 2 fitters mates and a foreman fitter. Total staff about 8. Now the total staff in the hospital, works-wise, engineering, is approximately 25. So there's been a great increase in staff over the years. Also a great increase in work procedures, sophistication in work procedures and so forth. In those days, basically, it was very ad hoc. Work was on demand, whereas now work is planned and phased, timed, costed and budgeted for.
I can recall when I first came to the hospital in 1979, The very first carnival that I attended, a marvellous day, absolutely brilliant it was. In fact, all day long it absolutely poured down, and unfortunately the main attraction on that particular day was a horse show.
Yes, well, that particular day, that was an early event in May, and I think it rained harder that day than it ever rained before or since. In fact, the horses stopped jumping, it was too wet for them. But nevertheless, we did show a slight profit, and then we went on to do the annual carnivals, which take place in August, as you became involved with from then on, didn't you?
That's right. Yes, all the money that we raised from the hospital carnival and the bonfires and other fundraising functions that we had have all been used to fund a hospital staff social club on site. I think one of the most important points about the annual carnival is over the years, is the effect that it has on staff morale. I remember when I first came, I think I saw staff for the week prior to the carnival running around selling teddy bears and all sorts of things. So, I mean, it was all very, very interesting the week before. Everybody was talking about the carnival. The morale was exceedingly good, and that's something that we like to see back in the unit again. And so I think the carnival's there to do that. And with the events of the social club now, we hope that the social club will once more bring a good morale to the staff of the unit.
Yeah, it's something that they look forward to now, and they talk about from one year to the next, don't they? And
yes.
It's when carnival time is coming around, quite a lot of people get very, very enthusiastic about it, don't they? And the same people are there year after year.
Now let's hear of some other developments in training, practice and facilities at the City General.
The building behind me is the College of Nursing and Midwifery for North Staffordshire. It was opened in 1985 by Lord Asa Briggs as the School of Nursing and Midwifery, and until 1989 it continued to function as a school, but since that time it has become a full-blown college and is now one of the first colleges of nursing and midwifery in the country.
Mentally ill patients have been admitted to the City General Hospital since the middle of the 19th century, first of all to the ordinary workhouse wards, and from about the 1880s special wards were built within the workhouse for psychiatric patients. This developed into what were called observation wards, and then after the Second World War they developed the beginnings of the present City General Hospital Psychiatric Unit, and the first consultant psychiatrist to the City General Hospital was appointed in the late 1940s and developed the first treatment facility in North Staffordshire for psychiatric patients in a general hospital. This makes the City General Hospital Psychiatric Unit one of the earliest psychiatric units in a general hospital in the country. The first consulting psychiatrist was appointed in the late 1940s. That was Dr. Gerald Van Summeren, who created treatment facilities where previously there'd only been an observation ward, and he was succeeded in 1954 by Dr. R.M. Phillips, who came here from St. Thomas's Hospital, London, and brought all the new methods of treating psychiatric patients in general hospitals with him. When he arrived, the psychiatric unit was surrounded by iron rails about 6 foot high. The patients all wore a standard sort of beige uniform. Protective gloves were available to prevent them doing any damage to the property. And of course straitjackets and padded cells were in existence at that time. Over the last 30 or 40 years there have been immense advances, and all these methods of physical restraint have vanished completely to leave us with a modern general hospital psychiatric unit, although unfortunately it is still the same architecture as existed 100 years ago. However, this unit has formed the basis on which have been laid plans for the building of a £13 million district general hospital devoted purely to psychiatry, which is going to commence building about 1992.
The Department of Respiratory Medicine opened over 30 years ago at the City General Hospital site with the help of a research grant, and was opened to investigate chest disease in industry. The present building we're in at the moment, we moved to in 1988. This was because the previous building was inadequate and cramped for the number of staff we now had, and also for the investigations that we were carrying out. The number of staff was originally 1 consultant, 1 technician and 2 nurses. The present number being 3 consultants, 7 secretarial and clerical staff, 6 technical and 2 nurses. We are now able to provide an efficient service for the investigation and treatment of chest disease, this being one of the most common causes of illness in the community and for people having time off work.
This is the cardiology department. It began in 1958 with just 1 technician in a small room. Over the years we've expanded into a department with 3 consultant cardiologists and 17 technicians. We have specialist tests and treatment areas, including an area for exercise for patients who are recovering from heart attacks.
This is our new purpose-built X-ray department in the new surgical and paediatric development. It replaces one in the old surgical square, which had been in use for, well, a long, long time. The advantages we've gained from moving into a new department are multiple, really. We've been totally re-equipped, equipment costing about £1.5 million. We have a lot of extra patient facilities, extra waiting areas, nice changing facilities, cubicles, pleasant areas for patients to sit. In addition, we've got a very nice play area fully equipped for children where mums and children can sit while they're waiting for their X-ray. The whole place is nicely decorated with pictures, very nice staff facilities and the most up-to-date equipment that really we could hope for. The old department we were sorry to leave. It was very homely. The staff were all used to it. We've gained extra staff and we're still busy settling into our new surroundings.
I think there's a lot of change from the patient's point of view as well. I think nurses and doctors and all the people who worked in a hospital regarded the hospital as theirs, and the emphasis was more or less, we'll get these patients in and we'll treat them and they'll do as they're told. Whereas it's now the patient who owns the hospital. It's the patient who actually comes to the ward and they demand of us. They ask for a service and we don't tell them anymore what to do. And I think that's taken a lot of adjusting for us. Because I remember when we trained, when we were on the old surgical wards, the emphasis came from a nursing point of view, where we actually used to have the old Cardex, and we just did it the patients, and we never actually asked them what they'd like from us as nurses or as doctors. Whereas now, when they come into the wards, we actually sit down through our nursing process and we have to ask them what they want. And very often, I don't think they really know what they want, to be honest with you, because they don't know what's expected of them. And the public have had a hard adjustment, but they're getting to know now what's their rights. And I think that's come through modern technology and education, because the people are actually becoming aware that they can demand of a health service. And we are now having to go out actually to meet that. But at the end of the day, the patients, they own the City General, not us.
So, this is our City General Hospital, a place with people and so many interesting buildings, which plays an important part in the healthcare of the people of North Staffordshire.